Hello, this is HT Wingnut, and today I wanted to give you a quick look at the Leven JS600 Pro, which is basically the same as the JS600, which I reviewed previously, a 2 terabyte as well as a 128 gigabyte model. And long story short, the endurance was pretty good, but the performance left a lot to be desired because with a lot of writes to it, the performance just tanked down to like 30 to 40 megabytes per second. So I noticed that someone brought up that they do offer one with a DRAM cache, and so I picked up the 256 gigabyte model. It's called the JS600 Pro, or also the JSD600. It contains apparently some DRAM cache, and so I did a quick benchmark on this guy to see if there's any improvement. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that here next. Here is the Amazon page for the Leven JS600 Pro SSD, the one that I'm evaluating today, also referred to as the JSD600. And you can see here it says SSD with DRAM cache. I previously evaluated an 128 gigabyte and a 2 terabyte SSD from Leven, but did not have DRAM cache. And I don't believe they actually had those available on here at the time I did it. But someone in the comments mentioned that 256 gigabyte version was available, so I snagged it and gave it a quick evaluation here. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and take a look at Crystal Disk Mark for this JS600 Pro. I ran it through a test with 5 total samples of 4 gigabyte total file size for each of the tests, and the results are pretty promising. You can see sequential read is about 560 megabytes per second. Sequential writes are about 505 megabytes per second, and 4K random is about 33 megabytes per second read and about 92 megabytes per second write. And I mentioned about the previous 2 terabyte and 128 gigabyte SSD without DRAM cache, just to show you when I wrote 1 gigabyte files across the entirety of the SSD, the performance tanked at about a third of the way through, or about a quarter of the way through. And then it just went down to about 30 to 40 megabytes per second. It recovered a little bit and then dropped down again. I did go through and give it some idle time to see if it could recover and improve performance, but in this area in general, it didn't matter what I did, the performance was just really pretty miserable. So I ended up running a similar test on this SSD. Basically, the dark blue here, you can see here, the vertical axis is a transfer speed of megabytes per second. Horizontal axis is gigabytes written across the SSD. So writing 1 gigabyte files, you can see that the performance was about 375 megabytes per second for writes until it hit about 60 to 70 gigabytes written, and then it just tanked down to about 140 megabytes per second the rest of the way. Now that's probably where the DRAM cache just couldn't keep up anymore. So what I did is I ended up every 20 gigabytes I paused the test for 10 minutes and then continued writing, and then paused and continued writing. So in my mind that should give the DRAM cache plenty of time to evacuate and write to the NAND flash on the SSD itself, and then continue on. And you can see by doing that every 20 gigabytes, giving it a 10-minute idle time, which is probably more realistic situation. If you're using an SSD, you're not just going to hammer it with several hundred gigabytes of data at once. So once you did this, you can see here across the orange, it was pretty consistent performance. You had a couple of dips down here and here, but overall performance was decent. You can see here with the blue, the original one with no idle time, it averaged 226 megabytes per second. Obviously the bulk of that was at the beginning of the write. And then with the idle time, you have 367 megabytes per second here. So it's not stellar, but it's not horrible either. And then reads, consistent across the board, 472 megabytes per second here. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is take a look at the DRAM cache itself on the SSD. Okay, so here's the 128 gigabyte SSD that I had evaluated previously without DRAM cache, and here's the new 256 gigabyte with DRAM cache. I had already disassembled the 128 gigabyte one, and you can see here that's all that's basically inside of this. And you can see it's got the controller chip and 1, 2, 3, 4 modules of NAND flash, and that's it. So we'll compare that with this 256 gigabyte version. You can also see this 128 gigabyte version is all plastic, and the shell on this one is actually all metal, which is the same as the 2 terabyte one that I had as well. To open these up, obviously they have a warranty void if removed sticker on it, and I believe that's illegal in the United States, but either way it comes right off pretty easily. I had the other ones that actually covered over the screw holes here, so we had no choice but to remove it if you wanted to secure it to anything. But in any case, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. Well, but basically you have to pry at the openings here to get it to open up. Wow, it's a much bigger PCB, and they actually do have some screws there. Phillips head screws. And there we go. Now, real curious here. Aha. You can see here is the controller chip right there, and then you've got your NAND flash right here. This is a 256 gigabyte SSD, so that would make each of these 64 gigabytes each. And then your DRAM cache is right there. There's really like no real, let's see if we can hold it up here. I don't see any markings on it that are, I can tell exactly how much it is or where it's from. So there's your 128 gig without DRAM cache. Here's your 256 gigabyte with DRAM cache. Alright, so I did manage to disassemble the 2 terabyte SSD again and cut myself in the process. Nice. But you can see here the 2 terabyte just has a single NAND flash chip here. There's a controller and no DRAM cache. So we compare that with this. PCB is twice as big, but it looks like they have room here, so you could add obviously more NAND flash chips to it. So to summarize here is the 128 gigabyte without cache, 2 terabyte without cache, and the 256 gigabyte with DRAM cache. DRAM cache is over here on the back. Overall, endurance is actually really good, at least based on the 128 gigabyte SSD. Hit it with over 280 terabytes of writes, and it kept on going. The 2 terabyte performance, as well as 128 gigabyte without DRAM cache, it would falter after about a quarter of the usage of the SSD, even given ample idle time to recover. But with the DRAM cache version, it actually performed pretty well. Give it a little bit of idle time and it will recover and give you good overall write performance. And read performance across the board was pretty good. So I hope that helps, and until next time, thanks for listening in.